That's the great question, Judge. They should not be prosecuted. They ought to be given the Silver Star for heroic action in combat. That's what should happen.
General Tom McInerney, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Judge.
The legal showdown over Utah's federal land. The state fights back. Next. I love those intros of Glenn. They're just terrific. A legal showdown is brewing out west over states' rights, with Utah Governor Gary Herbert authorizing the state use of eminent domain to seize the federal government's most valuable real estate. Now remember, eminent domain is the right of the government to take private property for public use. But this will be the first time in American history that a state is able to lay claim to federal land in this way. Supporters now hope this legislation triggers similar bills throughout the West. Here's Utah State Representative Carl Wimmer. He's a co-founder of the National Patrick Henry Caucus. And Josh Ebach, he's a policy analyst with the 10th Amendment Center. Representative Wimmer, to you first. Tell us what happened. What property do the feds own, and what property does Utah want to take from them, and how does it propose to do this?
Well, thank you very much, Judge. It's an honor to be on here with you to talk about this. It was a little less than a year ago that we announced the formation of the Patrick Henry Caucus on this very show. This particular piece of legislation is the brainchild of one of the co-founders of the caucus, Representative Chris Herod from Provo. And what this does is essentially creates a funding source and compels our Attorney General to claim eminent domain over certain pieces and parcels of land that the federal government has come in and taken from Utah.
All right, so the feds took the money from, took the property, excuse me, a Freudian slip there. So the feds took the property from Utah, paid Utah for it against its will. Utah accepted the money, deeded the property to the feds. Now Utah wants to reverse that project. What does Utah want to do with the property? Why do they lay claim to this real estate?
Well, at statehood, Utah was granted several parcels of land that was supposed to go to our school trusts. That money was supposed to be developed and or sold, and the money was supposed to go to help our children's education. Utah is the lowest funded per pupil in the nation because we have a lot of children.
Right.
What we want to do with it is we want to be able to develop these lands or sell these lands and have that money go towards our education system as it was intended at statehood. But the federal government has come in and locked up access. We can't even access a tremendous amount of the land that we were granted at statehood. Almost 70% of Utah is owned by the federal government.
Mr. Ebach, how unusual is this that a state would lay claim to federal property? I must tell you, as someone who watches the Constitution and the interplay between the states and the federal government for a living, I have never heard of a state seizing real estate owned by the feds. Have you?
No, Judge, I haven't, but these are strange times we live in, and this is not the first state in recent weeks and months to stand up to the federal government and say that you've overstepped bounds or you haven't upheld obligations that you have to the states and the citizens of the states. And we're at the 10th Amendment Center, we're very much in favor of states doing this kind of thing to push back.
Representative Wimmer, we're going to put on the screen a map of the western part of the United States. Now, if you start with California, you go to Nevada, and then you go to Utah. The red shows how much of the state of Utah is already owned by the federal government. Now, I know you can't see this from where you are, but it looks to me like it's 80 or 90% of the state of Utah is owned by the feds. What do they do with this real estate? What is it?
They do nothing with it. That's the problem. Right now, back in the 90s when they came in and commandeered the Grand Staircase Escalante under the Clinton administration, they locked up $1 trillion worth of natural resources, clean coal and natural gas. They continue to do the same thing, and Secretary Salazar has said that they're looking to create some more national monuments here in Utah. It's 70% of the land in Utah is owned right now, and it is high time that we've started fighting back and that we take this to court and find out who indeed is the sovereign. Is it the state that is set up to protect the sovereign people, or is it the federal government? That is the purpose of this particular piece of legislation, and we intend to fight it clear to the Supreme Court.
Josh, you can expect a tremendous pushback. Of course, from the Justice Department. They'll never accept this laying down, and it probably will go, because of the unique nature of this, all the way to the Supreme Court. What are the best arguments in favor of the right of a state to seize federal lands within the state, especially federal lands that aren't even being used for any discernible purpose?
I would have to say that the best argument in favor of the state making use of its own resources is the fact that the states created the federal government as a common agent to take care of their mutual needs. And if the federal government is monopolizing property that the states could use for their citizens, for their own freedom and their prosperity, and they're not able to make use of that property in a way that they would like to, that they should turn to the federal government and say that you're not upholding your obligations under the Constitution. And as such, we're going to take this land back and use it in a way that does benefit our citizens and does protect their rights.
Representative Wimmer, I guess you're going to need a battle chest for this one. You know that the feds will resist this to the hilt.
Absolutely. Here we are suing the federal government in federal court to get them to overturn federal decisions. No doubt it's an uphill battle, but we know that under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, which is the enclave clause, if the federal government is going to take land from the state, they have to coordinate that with the state legislature and get their approval. We've never given it. We've never given it, and we're not going to give it.
And they have to put the land to some discernible public use, which they haven't. Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us.
That's correct.
You thought the economy was hurting now? Wait till health care costs kick in. We'll examine them next. While the Democrats were celebrating health care reform becoming a law, not much was being said about the student loan provision, which was tucked away in the bill. Not only will your prescription drug coverage change, but the government will now distribute student loans, cutting out private lenders. Meanwhile, two more companies came forward today saying the president's health care reform is causing huge write-downs. Joining me now is Michael Cannon, Director of Health Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, and my good friend and Fox colleague David Asman, host of America's Nightly Scoreboard, seen at 7 p.m. on the Fox Business Network. As Neil Cavuto would say, if you don't have the Fox Business Network, you should.
Demand it!
Okay, we start with you, David. What kind of sense does it make in the midst of health care reform for the government, with no debate and no serious consideration, to restructure student loans?
The reason there was no debate, the reason it was put into this bill, because it wouldn't have survived as a standalone bill. This is the takeover by the federal government of the student. This is the public option. They say the public option wasn't in health care. Well, it was. This is a public option for students. And the worst thing about the student loan program, it doesn't work. It was initiated originally in 1965 to bring down the cost of college education. Ask anybody out there, except somebody who has a 100% loan guarantee, how much it's brought down the cost of college education.
Michael, where will the money come from to fund all of this stuff? If the Congress says to the state of Florida, for example, we just had Attorney General Bill McCollum on, come up with $1 billion that you don't have, are states actually going to raise taxes and actually spend their money the way the feds tell them on this?
The money's only going to come from one place, and that's from taxpayers. Now, they're going to try to hide the tax burden by making only some of it explicit in higher taxes. They've tried to hide some of it by forcing you to give a lot of money to insurance companies and by forcing your employer to take money out of your paycheck before you even see it. That's where the money for Obamacare is going to come from. And it's not just going to be $1 trillion over the next 10 years. Over the first 10 years of implementation of this law, it's going to be closer to $6 trillion. It's going to be the actual cost of this, and it's all going to come from the taxpayer.
David, do you think that the government anticipates some sort of civil disobedience? I mean, for example, why in this bill, and I've never seen a bill that changes the law call for hiring of this magnitude, does it call for the hiring of 16,000 new IRS agents? That would increase the size of the IRS by 30%.
Well, what's scary for me is not so much the fact that they are hiring these people as enforcers, but think of the IRS. The IRS is the one thing that in reverse of what you have dedicated your life to. You are guilty until proven innocent, according to the IRS. There are many businesses that have been closed down as a result of IRS investigations that turned out where the companies were innocent. But they can close you down before they've proved that you're guilty, and that's going to be applied to all of us now.
Michael, are you surprised that the government is upset that corporations like AT&T and Caterpillar and John Deere have said immediately, before the ink was even dry when the president signed this into law, we're losing, in the case of AT&T, $1 billion. In the case of John Deere, $150 million. The SEC requires us to reveal these likely losses. Are you surprised that these companies are coming to these conclusions?
Not at all. This really highlights why the Obama health plan is going to cost more than was projected, but not for the reasons that most Republicans and conservatives are saying. What these corporations are complaining about is they're actually losing a form of corporate welfare. The Medicare prescription drug entitlement program was basically bribing these companies in order to get them to keep offering their retiree drug coverage. What the Democrats did, this is one of the few aspects of this legislation, this law, that is actually worthwhile. They reduced the amount of that subsidy. So the corporations are upset because they're not getting their bribes anymore. Now, that is actually going to push their stock prices in the right direction. The problem is that when they lose some of that subsidy, a lot of these corporations are going to drop their retiree drug coverage. Those people, those retirees, are going to go into the Medicare Part D program, where it's going to cost even more to provide them drug coverage than it's costing the government right now.